In the 70s, a Swedish musical pop group known as the ABBA, composed of four people, two men, two women, became popular in the music industry. Their name, Agneta, Bjorn, Benny, and Anifrida. Most of their songs become a hit as their relationship turned into husbands and wives. Things came to a head in 1978. Agneta and Bjorn basically broke up that summer due to some philandering on the part of the husbands. Later on, the other couple joined the bandwagon of divorcees. ABBA songs then became gradually more wistful. Some would say sadder, as in the 1980s, The Winner Takes It All. While able to be joyful as appropriate, Agneta's expressions in videos increasingly became a frown, as if she were carrying a heavy burden and about to cry. And it's extremely difficult to look at some ABBA's later music and not read into them signs of their internal situations. So they broke up, the ABBA broke up. But finally, Agneta made some appearance with the other members of ABBA. In the following years, the Mamma Mia musical film revived interest in the band around 2007. But as one look into the lyrics, by the way, rest assured, I will not going to sing it. A phrase such as, "Look at me now, will I ever learn? I don't know how, but I suddenly lose control. There's a fire within my soul." So it shows a condition of oneself as the emotion within conflicts with one's decisions and thus affects the will as well as its acts. However, the Armenian in Jonathan Edwards' days strongly opposed that these faculties within man affects his will. And so the book was written to address this issue. So to begin with, we need to have a basic understanding of the era in which Edwards wrote this work. It was the Enlightenment period. It was in full steam. It was an intellectual and philosophical movement which dominated the world of ideas in Europe during the 18th centuries. These new ideas that challenged the long-held conceptions of how the universe works were being tested. Earlier philosophers whose work influenced the Enlightenment included Francis Bacon, René Descartes, and John Locke and Isaac Newton. They were all the rage. In the Enlightenment, man was at his most optimistic. So during this period, advances in science, medicine, and technology were taking place almost daily. And with these advances came the optimism that gave mankind a fresh reason to feel significant and meaningful existence. The point is that at the center of this then new conception was the idea that mankind is free to pursue his own agenda. That each man, it was suggested, should recognize his own freedom to choose his path. The will, it became popular to believe, was like the objective, neutral control center in the brain or in the human mind from which each man has the freedom to determine his own course. Next is the Great Awakening. It was a Protestant religious revival that swept Protestant Europe and British America in the 1730s and 1740s. And it was a fruit of preaching that gave listeners a sense of the personal revelation of their need of salvation by Jesus Christ. And the preacher who preached the heartfelt sermon, which resulted to this revival, was none other than Jonathan Edwards himself, the author of the book. So let's proceed to the motivation to writing this book. The enlightened opponents that Edwards is confronting here hold that the will is most free when it is most neutral. From their perspective, if the will has a preconceived inclination, it is not truly at a state of liberty. So Edward investigates the contrasting Calvinist and Arminian views about free will, God's foreknowledge, determinism, and moral agency. As Edwards attempts to resolve the contention surrounding these topics, he relies on a variety of textual resources, including the Bible and philosophical work of Enlightenment thinkers. So it was the prevalence of Arminianism in New England. This polemical work of Jonathan Edwards' Freedom of the Will was written to refute the dangers of Arminian in colonial America and the world. The central issue was the nature of man's will. B.B. Warfield observes about Jonathan Edwards, he was distinctly a great man. He did not merely express the thought of his time or meet it simply in the spirit of his tradition. He stamped it and molded it. New England thought was already making toward that colorless theology which marked it later. Then he checked, it was decidedly Arminian. He made it Calvinistic. So you can see how Edwards took note the impact made by Jonathan Edwards into combating the Arminianism during those days using the book Freedom of the Will. And secondly is the proliferation of writing materials which advocate freedom of the will. According to Arminianism and Edwards' primary opponent, Thomas Chubb, the will of every human was free. That is, each individual has his own self-determining power, completely free from any antecedent cause and lacks any internal nature that is inclined to sway any motive. So he answered back the collection of tracts on various subjects. Those are the pamphlets which Jonathan Edwards combated. So another author who provoked the writing of the Freedom of the Will was Daniel Whitby. Whitby was an Arminian minister of the Church of England who was known for his anti-Calvinist viewpoint and his statement that a person, or it is better to deny prescience, means foreknowledge, than liberty. It is this claim that Edward attempts to answer in the Freedom of the Will. And one of his responses was, a person may freely choose whatever seems good, but that whatever it is that seems good is based on an inherent predisposition that has been foreordained by God. So another one, Isaac Watts, although he is not referred to by name in the treatise of Jonathan Edwards, but only as the author of an essay on freedom of the will in God and the creature. He was a leading nonconformist and preacher. And of course, he was mainly known as composers of main hymns. In fact, during these seasons, the Joy to the World is being sung. So that was his composition. So he wanted to moderate Calvinist doctrines about freedom. So he was termed as dissenter. So Watts wanted to say that the mind is not causal in the way that nature is, and that this would leave room for human freedom. Now, let's proceed to the book itself. So the overview is that it was written in Boston in 1754, and if you take a look at it, the overview is it examines how the human free will engages with God's sovereignty. The freedom of the will, by the way, uses the text of Romans 9:16 as its basis. It examines the nature and the status of humanity's will. The book takes the classic Calvinist viewpoint of total depravity of the will and the need of humanity for God's grace in salvation. So it is an attempt at answering the questions, do we truly have freedom to decide our destiny? Or is it somehow determined for us? And this leads to his thesis, which is, we are free to choose that which we most desire. For Edwards, moral responsibility is not inconsistent with God's determining disposal of all events of every kind. So let's proceed to overall content. Part 1, it's a statement and explanations of various terms belonging to the ensuing discourse. So here, in part 1, Edwards engages in what we would call today ordinary language analysis, defining key terms and drawing key distinctions as they relate to the free will controversy. Edwards defines philosophical concepts like necessity and ability that will be used incessantly throughout. Part 2, whether there be any free will, as that therein the Arminian placed the essence of the liberty of all moral agents. Here, as if the Arminian concept of free will, the Arminian concept of free will, by the way, is a self-caused, uncaused, or indifferent will, is intelligible. Of course, Edwards answered in the negative. So part 3, whether the Arminians' notions of the freedom of the will is essential for people to be moral agents and thus capable of doing what is praised or blameworthy. So his answer is it is not essential. So whether the Arminian notions, so part 3, it challenges the Arminian assumptions that their notions of free will is essential to moral responsibility. Here, Edwards attempts to answer an important question. If we are already predisposed to either good or evil, what is the point of calling a choice morally good or bad? Edwards answers this by replying that one's disposition is exactly what makes a person's action worthy of praise or blame in the first place. Now, part 4, the chief grounds by which Arminians support their notions and oppose Calvinism. Edwards considers a host of objections against his positions that are still made to this day. For instance, doesn't moral necessity, when we say moral necessity, it is that we must do what we are inclined to do. Doesn't moral necessity make human beings mere machines? Edwards proved that it was not the case, because the necessity involved in human behavior is that of having to act according to choice and do what one pleases. So, of particular help to many will be Edwards' formal conclusions. Here he dealt about the famous reform acronym TULIP. So, it is up for you to read this book. But with the winsome defense of Calvinism, he arrives at his final resolution, which is God's grace is absolutely necessary to overturn the sinful heart of the rebellious person and turn them to Jesus. But in doing so, God rewires our predispositions so that we freely and willingly choose to savor Christ and follow Him by faith. A glancing of the title might lead some to think that Edwards and Luther differed. This is not so essentially. The title illustrates the thesis of Edwards that we are free to choose that which we most desire. But here are some similarities that we... Let us go to the legacy. All of this might make our brain bleed, but Jonathan Edwards is a more influential figure in modern times than you might think. In fact, the book is widely considered in the academic circles as primary reference. And one of the leading professors in the University of Amsterdam by the name William van Blastuwen wrote, "The fact that Edwards wrote about anthropological themes, including freedom of the will, indicates that he was a modernist, which makes him a suitable partner for our age. Edwards combines a deterministic worldview on the one hand with morality and responsibility on the other, which makes it interesting to look at the structures of his thought processes." So the fact that the secular academic world is taking note of these profound philosophical arguments, every intellectually capable Christian should consider reading Jonathan Edwards' Freedom of the Will. So I have taken note of the verse or the passage John 5:40 because we often encounter Arminians who use this verse to prove their free will. So we are not disagreeing with them. We believe in free will, but with different sense. Because as we have studied, the free will during those times, and I don't know if it's still prevalent today, that it is a neutral will, where for us, our will is bound. It has boundaries, and because of the fall. And as you can see here, the Lord Jesus Christ said, "And ye will not come to me, that ye might have life." So there was only one response, which is in the negative. And Arthur W. Pink said about this that the sinner is born with a will that is not in a condition of moral equipoise, because in him there is a heart that is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. We know he quoted from Jeremiah 17:9, and he said, and this gives him a bias toward evil. Also, Spurgeon in his sermon said, the will is well known to all to be directed by the understanding, to be moved by motives. 4 points he gave. First, that every man is dead. Secondly, that there is life in Jesus Christ. Thirdly, that there is life in Jesus Christ for everyone who comes for it. And fourthly, the gist of the text lies here, that no man by nature ever will come to Christ. So the point is that no man by nature thinks he needs Christ. That is, no one has the moral ability to come to Christ. As his sermon said, it is not a physical but a moral inability. And this is not in their nature, but in their fallen nature, not of God, but of sin. It may be said that they could serve God if they liked, but in that if lies the hinge of the whole question. So in conclusion, I'd say this, that Edward held that because of original sin, man's inclination are bent towards sin. And secondly, man cannot of his own free choice choose what is contrary to his desire. So that's the sense of the free will that Jonathan Edward espouses. As we can see in Romans 8:5-7, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. For to set the mind on the flesh is death. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. So as by pastoral application, if it is possible, we might defend our doctrines in different angles. So we must be polemical. So in having the Bible as the primary source, as I observed Edwards, he used different references in different areas. But for us, we may rest assured that the Bible is enough for us to defend our faith. But be straightforward. Whenever we present our case, it should be direct to the point as to avoid being misunderstood. This is what happened to Edwards. I wrote some articles that did not understand him because he was not concise and precise. We can say that he did his treatise in a overkilling manner. And be prayerful, of course. Pray for the person who differ with us as we understand man's disposition and his dire need of God's interventions. So man cannot be compared with machines because he has reason and understanding with the faculty of will, and so is capable of volition and choice.
Going to Edward's thesis, we are free to choose that which we most desire. Isn't that what others will argue as not true, because there are things we desire, and yet we do not have the will to opt for that desire?
We do not have the will to. Of course, if man knows that there are some barriers to perform, like, of course, man wants to fly. For example, he wants to fly, that is his will, but he knows that he has limitations. So there are certain circumstances that it applies that way.
Well, doesn't that show the fallacy of the definition for the thesis, that we are free to choose that which we most desire?
Yeah, that seems.
We can desire something, but we are not free to choose
Because that is the sense. You see, it may look like paradox. But as we as Christians know, it has been taught here and in the class. In fact, I learned much from lecture number 16. If you are going to sum up the teaching of Jonathan Edward, it is lecture 16, Human Free Agency. So if you are not able to read the book, then the thought of his teaching would be there exactly as it is.
How do you differentiate what Spurgeon may distinguish between physical inability, not being physical,
Spurgeon. Since Spurgeon, we learn from Spurgeon about these two elements. We have the moral and physical. So in terms of moral, we are able to spiritually, because spiritually we are unable to perform any good because of the sin, and that was his preaching. So it takes the power of God, it takes the grace of God for man to be able to free himself from that boundary. So that is under the category of moral necessity.
Explain what you said, Jonathan Edwards didn't overkill.
I would say that he didn't overkill because even those arguments that are not included in the articles which he wrote, he defended. I mean, he thought of what might an Armenian argue, and he would answer that. So there's no need for that to answer, because if he was able to answer those in the books, there's no need to add from them. And also, he used metaphysical, psychological, philosophical, mostly philosophical. And in the part 1 of the freedom of the will, he said that the reason why they were mistaken is because they did not use the common definitions of those terms. So, I mean, in part 1 pa lang, napataob na niya yung mga kalaban. Kasi, binigay niya yung definition ng mga terms. Kaya po masabi ko na overkill. So, siguro, ang madagdag na lang dyan, magbigay na lang siya ng mga talata ng Biblia. At tapos na. I think so.